From Troy Public Radio, Troy University, and the Wiregrass Archives in Dothan, Alabama, this is It Came from the Archives. I'm Greg Phillips. Each episode, we delve into the archives to bring you a topic, introduce you to someone new, or tell you a story about the Wiregrass region and the surrounding area. Our guide is Marty Olliff, director of the Wiregrass Archives at Troy University. So we've got kind of a little bit of a morbid topic in this edition, I would say. We are looking back through some very, very cool and interesting, but also sad photographs of some calamities that have taken place in the Wiregrass involving railroads, which of course were at one time the preeminent mode of travel throughout the country. So Dr. Olliff, we're going to get started with an incident that occurred in 1917 near Dillard. Now, for those that don't know where Dillard is, where is that in the Wiregrass?
It's just north of Ozark in Dale County.
Well, talk us through this 1917 incident and how it came to your attention at the Wiregrass Archives.
Well, the first thing is to say that this episode of the podcast is going to be about 3 of these train wrecks, and I've come to them because I was looking through the Tom Solomon photograph collection, which is railroad-centric, and we have to say that railroading in the early 20th century could be really dangerous, and train wrecks could be absolutely terrible, but they were also spectacular. So people flocked to them, and of course, if they were something that drew attention of people, photographers would go out too. And like I said, these are photographs of the Tom Solomon collection, record group 146, available through the Wiregrass Archives website.
And for those that may want to have a little bit more information about each of these incidents, you can, of course, catch Dr. Olliff's It Came from the Archives blog posts on Troy Today, the official blog of Troy University. So just throwing that out there as well.
Yeah, thanks for doing that. This 1917 accident was truly spectacular. Engineer Richard G., known as Dick Morgan, and his fireman W. Brown Hunter were driving the Atlantic Coastline passenger train number 57. The engines have numbers, the trains have numbers. They were going northbound from Dothan on Sunday, June 24th, 1916. At about 6:20 a.m., they rounded a curve about a mile north of Dillard, which is about 5 miles north of Ozark. The rail beneath them apparently sprung out of alignment, and it threw the train into the ditch, a pretty deep ditch that was on the side of the rail embankment. Now, these photographs, they're horrendous. They're horrendous. It's after the fact. People are crawling all over this train wreckage. The engine that was thrown down into the gully looks actually to me to be deflated. It's pushed so far down into the dirt on its side that it actually looks like air has been let out of it. It's remarkable. That engine pinned and suffocated Dick Morgan, the engineer, and the newspapers reported that he continually held on. He was found deceased, holding on to the controls like he was still trying to steer the train. And so the newspapers make kind of a big deal about that, how heroic he was. And it only trapped that fireman, Brown Hunter. What happened to Brown Hunter was worse than what happened to Dick Morgan. He was alive, he was alert, he was talking to people. They couldn't get him out, but he wasn't in a lot of danger until a steam pipe burst and scalded him to death. But he didn't die immediately. He remained alive for an hour after he was scalded and after all of the steam hit him. It was just terrible. Morgan, the engineer, was 53. And of course, ironically enough, he was just about to retire, having served 30 years on the line. And Hunter, who was only 29, had been with ACL Atlantic Coastline for about a decade. He had been promoted to what they called extra engineer. But this is just after we got involved in World War I and after we've been mobilizing for World War I for a little while, particularly the trains. After 1915, the trains started mobilizing for World War I. But there were cutbacks in personnel, and so he wasn't working as an extra engineer at that point. He was a fireman, the guy shoveling the coal into the engine. 3 other trainmen were injured, but they were treated at the scene by Ozark doctors. They were on cars further back. This wreck, because people loved Dick Morgan, people in the railroad and people that knew him in Montgomery as neighbors, and everybody loved Dick Morgan. And so the site of that accident for years after that was called the Dick Morgan Curve. And you can see it on the map. It's a big, long curve, and it just took a few spikes to turn loose before it became the Dick Morgan turn.
You mentioned Mr. Morgan and kind of how people loved him and looked up to him in the community. It mentions here that he was considered one of the pioneer railmen of Montgomery, according to the Montgomery Advertiser at the time. And having worked in railroads for 30 years, I'm no math expert, but that puts, he would have had to be one of the earliest railroad people in this area.
1887, I suspect, if he was pushing 30 years, he started between 1887 and 1890. In railroads, one of the first rail line to come to southeast Alabama out of Montgomery was what became the Atlantic Coast, the Alabama Midland Railroad that was commissioned by a group in Troy itself. And a bunch of the highfalutin business people in Troy, like O.C. Wiley, became heavily involved in that push. And they ran that line eventually from Montgomery through Troy, through Ozark, through Dothan, over to Bainbridge, Georgia on the Flint River. And then the plant system bought them out and ran that line all the way over to Waycross, Georgia. And then the Atlantic Coast Line bought the plant system, and Southern Railway bought in also, and they ran that over to Savannah. So there's a big swooping loop from Savannah through Bainbridge, through Dothan, up to Montgomery. And that line is still operational today. They still use it. So this next wreck that is in the Solomon photographs occurred in 1945. And on September 24th at 2:05 p.m., Atlantic Coast Line train known as the Extra 452 West, because these trains are not easily numbered, coming out of Dothan, collided headlong into the Atlantic Coast Line second 180 East. It killed the engineer in the 452. His name was James Mangum. He was also of Montgomery, and it injured 16 other people. So the Interstate Commerce Commission investigated this particular accident, and in its report, it noted that the ACL line from Waycross through Dothan up to Montgomery was single track. So you got 2 trains on the same track going in opposite directions. Something's going to give, right? Well, they had a way to deal with this that was a little bit older and kind of complicated. So governing those train movements to prevent wrecks required designating one of the trains as the superior train and one of them as the inferior train. So you got a superior train and an inferior train. Then the railroad had to issue strict orders to the inferior train to pull onto a siding at a particular time. We know by our schedule that you guys are going to be on the same block of track for a while, at 2:10 p.m., for example. And so at 1:45, you, the inferior train, have to pull off at the siding 3 miles away from this particular point so that train can pass you, and then you back up and get back on the track, and off you go. And to make that work requires on the absolute shakiest foundation that the people on the train will do what they're told. The Extra 452 in this case was the inferior train. It consisted of a locomotive, a tender, and a caboose. A 3-car train. The train, second 180, was superior, And it was pulled by an engine driven by engineer Jim Potter of Montgomery, and it consisted of 6 unoccupied Pullman cars. So just the train crew on that one, just 3 or 4 people on the other train. Solomon's photos and this ICS report tell us that engine 452, train extra 452 West, the carriage and the boiler, when they hit so hard that it tore them apart. That is, the impact tore the boiler off of the carriage and threw them off separately. The cab slammed forward, and that's what killed the engineer, Mangum. The locomotive then twisted off the track, and the tender hit the locomotive in the rear and lifted it up into the air. So that when the train stopped, this locomotive housing, which had been slammed forward, was sitting up in the air. The caboose shattered. It was a wooden car and just splintered. And that's where most of the injuries occurred. This other train, the second 180, its locomotive derailed. It landed on the right side next to the track. Its tender and only the front carriage of its first passenger car derailed. So it did not suffer greatly from this. In talking with the ICC, the fireman on the 452 said that Mangum, the engineer on the 452, hadn't pulled into the siding at Youngblood, Alabama. And so I asked him about it, and Mangum just brushed him off, said, "We don't need to pull over because we're going to stop very suddenly in just a few minutes." The ICC concluded, quote, that this accident was caused by an inferior train occupying the main track on the time of an opposing superior train, in good ICC bureaucraties. Now, this was only one of many wrecks that had occurred in the previous half year on similar ACL tracks. And so the ICC's recommendation was that the ACL, the Atlantic Coast Line, switch from controlling trains by timetables and train orders and obedience to the safer method called the block system that identifies sections of track that they call blocks, and then they establish a green and red signal on these blocks. And when the signal is red, signaling a train is coming at you, then you're supposed to pull off. And that 2 trains cannot be on the same block, which are just miles long. They can't be on the same block. Sometimes you'll cross a train track, and you might look off to the side and see a little sign that says Block 141. Mm-hmm. That's a part of the block system. Now, we still see that today. They still use it today.
And if people have a chance to look at these photographs, I highly recommend it because they do paint a picture of just how devastating this accident was, and how all 3 of these accidents, which we're about to talk about the third one, but these photographs really illustrate the the danger of the job and the danger of even being a passenger at the time on a train because of what I'm assuming was a far, as you mentioned, a far greater frequency of these occurrences in the early 20th century than we would have today. Puts into context how hard it was for people to travel long distances between states.
Right. Long distance travel, before there were high-speed highways and cars that wouldn't break down every 5,000 miles, tires that were guaranteed for more than 5,000 miles, traveling any distance at all was difficult. Very difficult. And we talk about people never leaving their home or never leaving more than 5 miles from their home, because that was about as far as you could get in a day, unless you had some kind of real pressure to keep on moving.
Right. That's wild. And that, of course, that brings us to our third train wreck here that we're going to talk about. This comes to us in 1963, and this is a little bit different than the other 2, but very similar also. So,
well, the similarity is people died.
Yeah.
And this was, in 1963, reported at the time as being the worst train car accident in Alabama history. And it occurred just north of Dothan in Midland City, which is between Dothan and Ozark. So Now, think about this. Think about the context of this. We were just talking about cars and trains. This was a car-train accident, merging those two forms of transportation in a way you don't want them merged, accidentally. But think about 1963. 1963 was a remarkably important year in Alabama and around Alabama. It opened in January with Governor George Wallace being inaugurated and giving his segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever speech. Then in the spring, beginning in about April, there were civil rights marches that erupted in Birmingham, and in April, Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested at these marches and penned his letter from Birmingham jail. And then in May was the Children's March, and we remember that one because that's when Bull Connor let loose the fire hoses and the dogs onto the marchers. Then in May, and a lot of people don't know this one, in May, Attorney General Bobby Kennedy was coming down to Alabama to have a not really an off-the-record, but not a real publicized meeting with Governor George Wallace. They were political allies. They didn't think the same thing, but they were both, strong Democrats. And so Kennedy was coming down. Wallace, in order to welcome Bobby, giving him a wave, probably with the middle finger, raised the Confederate battle flag over the state capitol. Now, a lot of people think the Confederate battle flag had been over the state capitol for decades. No, it was raised in May of 1963 for George Wallace to thumb his nose at Bobby Kennedy. Coming down. Now, you remember that flag was removed in 1992 by Governor Guy Hunt after a successful lawsuit by Representative Alvin Holmes. That same summer in 1963, Governor Wallace stood in the schoolhouse door. And on exactly that same day, later in that evening, President Kennedy went on national TV and proposed the Civil Rights Act that then was passed in 1964. The March on Washington took place in August of 1963, and on November 22nd, President Kennedy was assassinated. So big year in Alabama and in U.S. history. Well, but you know how history is. It doesn't necessarily affect people on the ground, at least not for a while. And this is very true of a family in southeast Alabama named the Langfords of Dale County. On Pearl Harbor Day of 1963, Saturday, December 7th, 2 weeks after the Kennedy assassination, 12 members of the Langford family piled joyously into their old station wagon for one of their regular Saturday trips to town. The patriarch and matriarch of the family, Henry and Lavinia Langford, at least 5 of their children, including adults, at least 2 of their daughters-in-law, and 5 of their grandchildren lived in the same house. And they worked on the property of C.E. Dassinger on his farm in Pinkard, on the Pinkard Midland City Road, which is Highway 134 now. People considered the Langfords to be hardworking, if poor, but they were also considered to be particularly religiously devout. They attended the Assembly of God church that was near their house, and they had attended every service in that Assembly of God revival that was going on the previous week. They were there every night. The pastor at one point said that if he didn't see them in church on Sunday, he knew something was wrong. So usually the family, when they took that Saturday excursion, went either into Ozark or into Dothan. But that particular Saturday morning, the son, 18-year-old Douglas Langford, was driving his father, Henry, to a doctor in Headland. It was common then, and I'm old enough to remember this, it was common to pile as many passengers as you could get into a car because seatbelts were not mandatory until 1968. 5 years later. So why did they all go? Well, 4 of these grandkids needed new shoes. It's December, so the rest of them were excited to visit Santa Claus. And even though they didn't have a lot of money, they were still going to do some Christmas shopping over in Headland. One of the passengers was a 13-month-old granddaughter. So son Douglas Langford drove from Pinkard, and he could have crossed the railroad tracks at 3rd Street in Midland City. That's just straight across from where he was coming. But the ACL train called the Extra East, which was a pulpwood train driven by a Dothan engineer, was bearing down on that crossing. So Langford turned right onto Napier Field Road and headed for the crossing at 5th Street. And I can't tell you if he was trying to beat the train, but if I was an 18-year-old, I would have tried to beat that train. So he turned left onto 5th Street. It was a sharp turn, and the railroad tracks were really close to the street. So to make the turn, he had to slow down. Then he had to accelerate. And of course, this was a manual transmission with 12 people in the car. So he popped that clutch. He got to the top of that real steep incline, and he died on top of that, or his car did at that point, on top of the tracks. And this was an older station wagon, so who knows if it was underpowered. I don't know what kind of car it was, but we had a 1959 station wagon, and it was definitely underpowered. It took a lot to make that thing move forward.
My Mazda that I drive now would probably have a hard time doing that with 5 people in the car. So
oh, yeah, same deal. So there was no grade crossing gates there. There still aren't. I was just over there a few days ago. And the crossing, like we said, was steeply inclined. One witness saw this happen. He said that the car stalled out on the tracks, that the engineer blew his whistle twice, and then there was that sickening crunch of the collision. Witnesses that heard that ran or jumped into their own cars to drive over to the wreck site, and what they found was the crumpled car and its passengers lying in a ditch 128 feet east of the crossing. They got hit and they sailed 128 feet into a ditch. 2 of them were alive, including the driver. These are people inside the car. The driver and the other passenger were transported to Southeast Alabama General Hospital in Dothan, so they made it to town, but they succumbed to their injuries. The baby was not in the car. It was thrown 20 feet further from the wreck, and it survived with only a bump on its head.
That's ridiculous. That's crazy. That's like out of a movie. Do we know what ever became of that baby?
No. I know her name, but I don't know her current name. She would be approximately 63 now, and I am not even thinking about trying to track her down. If she happens to hear this,
absolutely,
get in touch with me.
If you're out there, please reach out to Dr. Olliff or to me, and thank God you survived.
Yes, absolutely. Well, so the Dothan Eagle covered all of this. It was pretty extensive. They covered it day after day after day, and this aftermath was just absolutely ghastly. They held a visitation for, you know how you do when people die. They held a visitation. All 11 of them simultaneously, in the Langford home, where they had to move all of the furniture out of the front rooms. They packed it into the back rooms. They packed it out onto the porch to get all 11 coffins. And sadly, there were adult-sized coffins, teenager coffins, and child coffins in that room. Terrible. Yes, just terrible. The funeral was at that Assembly of God church that was near their house, and the victims are all interred at the Magnolia Free Will Baptist Church Cemetery, which is just right up the road from the Troy University Dothan campus, almost walking distance. And the community response was substantial. The Eagle reported that 300 cars accompanied the funeral procession from the church to the cemetery, which was about 2 miles. And charities collected a lot of money in support of the burials and the surviving family members. A lot for the time. We're talking a few $100s in small donations. In fact, having read the story in the local newspaper, their local newspaper, and thinking that the baby was orphaned, that the entire family had been killed, a Huntsville couple even offered to adopt that baby. But they were told, of course, that no, the baby's father was still very much alive. He had not gone with them that day. The engineer, for his part, required multi-day sedation. A little bit later on, a few days later, the Eagle had a picture of him visiting with the baby and her father. That must have been a tough one. So Tom Solomon, and we know this, took 4 snapshots of the scene within days, possibly within hours of the accident. In each of these, in 3 of these, people are examining the spot where the crushed car landed. 2 show the scene from the northwest, which would have been looking from the train's direction, and one of them shows the steepness of the crossing. One of them shows the scene and the crossing from the southeast, and in that picture there is another station wagon just casually parked across the track.
This is eerie. I'm looking at that photograph right now. It's very eerie. Clearly they weren't concerned at that time.
Yeah, clearly at that point they were not concerned. And I don't know if that station wagon was parked there for the benefit of the photographer, or if somebody just decided that they were going to park right across the middle of the track in a station wagon. And again, we don't have any real information on what was going on in these pictures. We're just talking about what we can find
Surmise,
from them.
right. Well, it's interesting that seeing this here, because as somebody that's driven through this area, you can drive right by where this happened today, and it looks almost exactly the same.
Yes.
Like this area has not changed really at all in, 50 plus years. No.
It's 60 years.
60
actually.
years, right.
It's grown up a little more. I just went over there the other day before finishing up this particular story, and like I said, a little bit overgrown. If you look at the picture, you can see that the track is tilted just a little bit. Well, they've corrected that. It's a flat track. It's a long rail that's extruded rather than pieced together, so they don't have the connectors in it. But it's still a steep incline coming up off of Napier Field Road, and you can kind of see where the car landed still. It's remarkable. Well, and the last photograph that Solomon took of this particular one, and it seems very innocuous until you know what it is. It's a picture of the train sitting a couple of miles away at the Grimes siding, waiting for a new engine to come and pick it up. It's got a couple of tankers and some pulpwood cars and all of that. So, yeah, railroading, extremely dangerous then and now.
So we've reached the end of this episode, but definitely not the end of the Wiregrass archives. There is still so much to discover and so many more stories to be told on this podcast. You can find more information on your own at troy.edu/wiregrassarchives. If you like this podcast, be sure to tell a friend, and we'd love it if you left a review in the App Store. That helps other people find this show. I'm Greg Phillips, joined as always by Marty Olliff, director of the Wiregrass Archives in Dothan, Alabama. This episode was recorded in the studios of Troy Public Radio and was produced by Austin Toy and Joey Hudson with help from Kyle Gassett. Thank you for joining us for this episode. We'll be back again soon to tell you another story, and you'll know it came from the archives.